I can hear you and see your screen share.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, let me start over. So welcome, my name is Chris Barrington-Leigh, and I'm faculty at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. And I want to talk a little bit about the possibility of changing how governments, but also society, thinks about what our objective is, what progress is, what government is supposed to be doing, and in particular, what it would mean to go through some kind of a transformation so that policies could be made with a kind of a scientific eye on promoting human well-being. The hardest part of my talk today is going to relate to explaining what I think about how sustainability would work into this. But here's the outline. So I just want to start to make sure we're on the same page. I have a rather specific meaning of well-being in mind, of the various ones that the ISQLS crowd will be used to, and I'll explain the concept of well-being budgeting, and then I want to talk about the institutions that I think are new to kind of a new policy-making framework, and then also try and convince you that they're not so new. And the last part is I won't really get to, but after explaining that the new institutions sort of exist, there's more in the paper behind this talk about transition, and communication is not even really in the paper, but there are others who have thought about some of this stuff already. So you can read the paper behind the talk for more of those details, and I've put links to that and also other relevant papers, and I'll add some other relevant presentations there. For brevity, that's all available at this link here, which you can easily copy since I can't easily make a link for you to click on. Okay, so when I talk about quality of life or well-being or happiness, I'm just going to mean in any of those cases the same thing, which is one specific measure of those, and that is this satisfaction with life measure. And what does that mean, a measure? It means it's the answer that people give on literally a single survey question. So taking all things into account, how satisfied are you with your life these days on a scale of 0 to 10? This is kind of has plenty of pedigree. It's well established now, and it's a quantitative answer people give on a 0 to 10 scale. This question asks a lot of the respondent. It essentially puts a lot of our philosophical and kind of aggregation problems, buries them all in the cognitive process needed by the respondent to answer the question. So just to be clear, to distinguish this from some other measures of subjective well-being, of which satisfaction with life is one, this is not asking about affective experience, so it's not asking about emotions in the moment. It's asking about something more cognitive, which means it tends in the data to relate to more ongoing experiences, although certainly affective states and recent affective states are part of the evidence that we use in coming up with an answer to this question. Interestingly, this approach to the approach surrounding use of this question to inferring what it is that is good for people, what we might want to pursue in terms of human well-being, does not rely at all on people's beliefs or instinct about what might be good for them. So one way to go about thinking about developing measures of progress for policy would be to solicit views about what are the important metrics that relate to well-being, or what are the important even policy agenda that relate to well-being. So somewhat unusually, the life satisfaction approach doesn't do any of that, and instead it leaves that all up to the statisticians and this somewhat opaque process that people go through when they answer this question. I say opaque, but of course we now have decades of experience in which people make slight changes around the conditions and framing and whatever to understand how people answer this question. And to summarize all of that, how I think of all of that literature and experience is just that people are actually doing pretty much as close as as close as possible, as close as imaginable to what we would hope they would do in answering a question like this. So they are assessing what seems to be salient to them, to their conception of a good life, and they are going and accessing appropriate evidence that relates to those things. They are aggregating them up with appropriate weights, and they're even trying to avoid some of the inevitable biases which do affect people's answers, such as short-term conditions and so on. Okay, so these data are now widely available within many countries, across countries. Here's what a global picture of life evaluations looks like from a few years ago. You can see that average values at the country level range from about 3 to about 8. This question is quite standardized now. So there are, as I mentioned, several measures of subjective well-being, but the international recommendation is to use the single question, the 11-point 0 to 10 scale on a survey in order to capture all this all-encompassing human life evaluation. So it's not the only measure that's interesting, but it seems as good as we could hope for something that can really guide us to answer questions about what it is that makes life better and worse. So when I said that we leave all of those kind of answers up to the statisticians, I'll explain that a little bit more, but many of you are familiar with this idea. Typically, when we ask somebody the life satisfaction question, we're also learning a lot else about their life, ideally objective circumstances. And then when you have many such respondents, you can analyze statistically, or you can model in general what it is that makes for happy individuals, happy communities, happy countries. So this is another example of standardization of this kind of measurement. I shall skip that slide because the viewer I'm using doesn't like something in it. So now, these kind of measures are collected and reported now at the country level every year in the World Happiness Report. But of course, it's not just a matter of looking at differences across geographies or even changes over time of life satisfaction. What we're interested in is trying to understand where those differences and those trends or changes come from. And so in the World Happiness Report, you see analysis as to the causes, the determinants of life satisfaction, which is really what the industry of the science of well-being or the economics of happiness has been doing for a long time. So in that context, what is well-being budgeting? Life satisfaction is a measure of something, but we're left with endless mysteries if we just watch it go up or down or compare across individuals or countries, as I said. So the life satisfaction approach refers to this idea that we can evaluate other things by measuring them at the same time as we measure life satisfaction, and then to explain the differences or changes in life satisfaction as a function of the conditions or experiences that people are having. So the range of circumstances and experiences that are now evaluated in this way is quite large. Just to give some examples, we can talk about the value of having clean air. So the units of that would be change in life satisfaction per, let's say, change in, per 1 microgram per meter cubed of PM 2.5 or something like that, a rather salient measure as I speak today. The value of regularly seeing a family member in terms of change in effect on life satisfaction, the value of being able to trust your manager at work, value of trusting local police, value of feeling that you belong to a community or group or geographic region, the value of an extra $1 of family income, the value of not being subject to discrimination, the value of having an extra child, having a child, say, which you think about the value after 1 year or after 5 years or after 20 years. These are all things which have actually been evaluated. We can talk about the impact on life satisfaction. And they're not perfectly controlled experiments, as you might imagine, but with plenty of evidence and variation in respondents, we have increasing confidence in the hypothetical case where we actually imagine policy that manipulates one of those conditions for an individual or society. So the approach allows us to evaluate a remarkably broad set of life experiences and conditions and changes. And what's important is that those evaluations are all in the same units. In other words, the unit of life satisfaction, or in another formulation, it could be life satisfaction years if you want to take into account benefit over time and think about costs and benefits in terms of the payoff over time. So so then the evaluation actually is rather closely related to this, to the inference. It's just the application of these inferred values for the benefits, costs and benefits that we get from different outcomes, for instance, outside of a sample population, or for future outcomes that haven't happened yet. Or indeed, we could evaluate past policy looking at changes as well. So as I mentioned, there are now more than one, there are several efforts afoot to really formalize and concretize a cost-benefit analysis using this literature, using insights from this literature. And so rather than just think about units of life satisfaction, you may want to think about units of life satisfaction times years for as a measure of a social benefit. So this is one example. It's linked in the link I gave earlier of a formulation with an emphasis in this case on how this would apply to healthcare, but this is being applied to all different domains of policy. So moving on then to putting this into context of well-being budgeting, once we have this science, essentially, somewhat academic still, knowledge about these the impact on life satisfaction of different life circumstances, we can start to think about making decisions and influencing policy. And my characterization of what's happened in the last few years is very exciting. It's that this literature, this happiness literature, has been influencing bottom-up decision-making for a while. So you know, if you want to deliver your organization's mission with better outcomes for employees as well as customers, or you want to improve the internal functioning, or as an individual, you want to live a better life, people have been tapping into this literature for a while. What's happened in just the last few years is really people thinking seriously about top-down decision-making. And that ultimately means choosing what laws and regulations to make, and it means allocating resources. I.e. making a budget, choosing how to spend money within a particular domain, and even choosing possibly across domains, and according to some of us, even choosing the size of a budget. Since I can tell you the marginal effect on life satisfaction of an extra dollar of taxation on a family's budget, that means that in principle we could think about making policy even by informing the size of our budget. As well as how to spend it. So, so in the last couple of years, we have these global happiness policy reports that are also coming out, and these are synthesizing our best knowledge so far on, indeed, how one would make policy with an eye to the insights from life satisfaction. So the goal for this talk is briefly to describe a system in which measurement, inference, and decision-making can happen. And I should say that when I talk about this stuff with all three levels of government in Canada, people are interested, but no one is doing this yet. So what I'm talking about is really future directions and what needs to happen for these things to become feasible. And by the way, if you are in government, especially in Canada, and interested in regular meetings across jurisdictions and levels of government, please be in touch. Okay, so let me give this diagrammatic overview of the pieces that I think are part of this well-being budgeting framework. Here's my characterization of how part of policymaking happens now. You can imagine coming up with some prospective policies, and what anyone who's interested in advocating for them is interested in is to think about what the future outcomes of that policy are. And to do that, you have to have some knowledge about essentially investments, about what happens to if you build a new building or a piece of infrastructure today, or you invest in human capital, say by education or health or something else. How is that going to pay back to society in the future? And so importantly, I claim that this part is already in existence, right? So, so any government agency is already doing this kind of projecting in the future, although it's sometimes more and sometimes less formal, and indeed more and less quantitative. The new part in well-being budgeting is simply that once we predict, let's call them objective outcomes, so all the things that come out of our future projections that are in the natural units, you know, years of education, rate of particular chronic disease, so on, we can now translate those outcomes into the current well-being of humans in each future time point. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we can put disparate outcomes into a common currency, which is indeed more meaningful than trying to convert things into dollars through the maybe less well-grounded ways that we do now. But many things are never converted into monetary outcomes nowadays, and so a life satisfaction approach allows more things to be made into commensurable units, and indeed gives us a much more meaningful outcome, which also accommodates a wider variety of conditions. So I'm not going to emphasize that a lot today, but really one of the big insights from life satisfaction research generally is that we're very social beings, and so if you want to know how well off, how happy society is going to be tomorrow, you have to think a lot about non-material, about our social interactions, our social context, as well as the more standard economic and material outcomes. Okay, so this kind of a planning, simplified planning process fits into the broader framework in that we have on the left here the science of well-being. So this is kind of the research side. And so this starts off with surveys that include life satisfaction, but also many other descriptive, many other conditions of respondents. And we have some model which relates one to the other and maybe over time. And then you get statistical analysis, and this all builds up a knowledge base about the kinds of examples I gave earlier. So how valuable are these different traits in our lives? And by the way, just for future reference, notice that there are all kinds of environmental goods, pollution, green space, whatever, fit in here. So when we talk about sustainability, when I talk about sustainability in a moment, I'm not going to be talking about the these environmental outcomes which affect us quite immediately and which we can predict in the next few years or even, you know, for the current generation. And I'll skip those, you know, but these are other ones here just to say that once we have this kind of knowledge, we don't even need to measure life satisfaction all the time in order to be able to project how we're doing given other objective outcomes that may be easier to measure at high frequency or at high geographic scale. Okay, anyway, so this all fits together like this, but there's one piece that I skipped on the planning side, and that is as I have thought about this, I've come more and more to the conclusion this picture, the life satisfaction, the well-being budgeting part of this falls apart if we try to include some of the really big, difficult sustainability questions in this process. And so I'm giving them a special role and special place. And I'm going to come back to that after very quickly going over the some of these institutions here. Okay, so I've kind of mentioned, I've implied a couple of these already. Before I do that, I just want to squeeze in a word on why I'm so passionate about this topic and why I think transforming our, not just policy making, but what we expect of our government, so the public discourse as well as the policy discourse, into something that's oriented around human well-being is, in fact, I think it for reasons you can follow the links and read. I've written about this a fair bit, but I think this is rather essential for us to be able to tackle our biggest challenges, including our environmental and sustainability challenges, in an optimistic and future positive way. Okay, and I'll just give you a snapshot of what I mean by that. If we use the old approach of thinking about progress, we'll focus on a few material outcomes, essentially, say, consumption and longevity. If we use the science of well-being, we'll also take into account more aspects of human experience. And it turns out that the broader set is hugely important. So this is a paper about life and life satisfaction globally in 2050. And it turns out life in 2050 could get much, much better than we can achieve pursuing material growth alone. And that's this quadrant here. These are global average changes in life satisfaction. But it could also get much, much worse if we let the non-material factors deteriorate, if we let this broader scope of factors that life satisfaction can take into account. And that's true even if we maintain current income levels. Okay, in any case, that's kind of the important motivation behind this. But onto these institutions. The first one was measurement or indicators. Here are very briefly, three benefits of orienting indicators around life satisfaction. So the first one really has to do with communication. So if you have a set of metrics, a dashboard, or some kind of indicator system for progress, for well-being, with life satisfaction as a headline indicator, it communicates your intent. It communicates, it's also easy to understand for people who don't want to look into all of the details of many other more detailed measures. It's appealing, it's intuitive, and so it indicates your intent and also your accountability to human experience. It also provides, an indicator system built like this provides accountability to two things. One is to the structure of the rest of an indicator dashboard. So if you want to know what should go into an indicator system for well-being, life satisfaction can actually quantitatively guide you because of this ability, as I discussed earlier, to answer how important is item X for life satisfaction. And so in fact, the content and the weights in an indicator system, if there are weights, can be accountable to something, to this empirical experience. In addition, policy is softly, at least in principle, accountable to human experience if in such system. And then thirdly, of course, and this is the one that really this talk is about, is that an indicator system with life satisfaction as the giving the structure and as the central focus can give you this analytic power to guide decisions. So the first step then in a transition to well-being is to begin to reorient public perception and expectation about what policy is supposed to be doing, what it's trying to accomplish. And that begins with starting to measure what matters. Now, does this institution already exist? As I've said, the ones I'm advocating for do. Sort of. There's no revolution that's needed here. On the other hand, and there are plenty of well-being oriented dashboard indicator systems or progress indicators. On the other hand, no one really has one that with life satisfaction as a headline indicator that then gives discipline to the rest of the system. there are governments thinking about that, but no one has actually gone all the way towards that. Now, second, institution, and this one is the one that is new, but it's also already being built, and that is the collected wisdom from, initially the scientific community on what these payoffs, these costs and benefits, or what the relationship between life satisfaction outcomes and objective circumstances that we might be able to affect through policy. So if policymakers are to be able to do that last step I showed you in translating future objective outcomes into life satisfaction, changes in life satisfaction, there needs to be some established, credible data source for those relationships. So, you know, I call that thing the database of happiness coefficients. You might think of the IPCC's experience aggregating scientific evidence on climate change coefficients as an example of a process that it could be followed here for a transparent scientific community-based effort to aggregate such evidence. There's also a model of organizations like the UK-based What Works Center for Wellbeing, which is a little bit in this business as well. And then other, you know, I think it will come somewhat organically out of efforts of people such as my own, and also at least one group in Europe. But over time, I imagine that governments will have more of a hand in actually feeding information into these, because they're also able to do experiments and evaluations, maybe in partnership with academia, that that wouldn't happen otherwise. But just to give you a glimpse of the beginning, this is the top left, I suppose, corner of an ongoing effort that we have going to aggregate. To bring together evidence is a little bit focused on Canada, but these are some of the, you know, here's an example of a kind of consensus estimate of one of these life satisfaction effects. And okay, so not to belabor that, but these kind of things can now start to be aggregated across the literature in reviews and made maybe, hopefully, increasingly useful and usable for decision makers. Okay, so that's the indicators in the database of happiness coefficients. As I said, I'm not going to get to all of this. I want to now talk about this last part. So as I noted earlier in the flowchart, government agencies and private organizations make decisions by projecting their consequences into the future. So that's not new. No change is needed in a well-being budgeting approach. On the other hand, even though that's not, you know, that practice already happens, having the life satisfaction approach and tools makes such cost-benefit decisions more powerful, and it has the potential to bring different agencies together. So across disparate domains of policy and service, life satisfaction gives a common goal, synergistic outcomes, and even a quantitative language or an analytic language for evaluation. So what's needed there is simply more capacity for understanding the value of investments in humans for later in their lives, but not something fundamentally new. So okay, and I think it's natural in a well-being approach that this kind of capacity is going to be more worthwhile and will have more investment. So New Zealand is maybe an example where they're thinking more detail about human life course already. Now, also want to just reiterate, as already mentioned, that current and near future air quality, water quality, access to wild and green spaces, and so on are things that can be treated within, already are within a life satisfaction approach, or can be treated within a well-being budgeting approach. On the other hand, what about the stuff that's really long-term that affects our children or our grandchildren and our descendants, relates to things we haven't even experienced before, so we can't study empirically, or is extremely complex and our models maybe can predict, but with very high uncertainty. So this is the kind of thing, so this is how I'd like to define sustainability for the purpose of just this topic, is to refer to the kinds of things that we cannot calculate well or predict confidently in the framework I've already described, and yet which might be important. So there's actually a lot of things like this. You know, there are all of these very unlikely, but possibly highly important things that people are actually taking quite seriously, calculating the probabilities of. So if we want to think about how much we should be allocating to those, it becomes very hard to do that even in a relatively mature well-being budgeting framework like I've described. So if you were to think seriously, how much should we be allocating to these things, you may need to, my point is that you will need to appeal to something else other than our evidence about life satisfaction. And I'm not saying whether we should be doing more or less on these kind of black swan events I just mentioned. But my point is that things with enormous impact and non-zero probability are bundled with so much uncertainty that if you bring them into a cost-benefit analysis alongside more mundane things, it'll mess up the whole process. It'll overwhelm it, right? So if you're trying to make a decision like this, allocating between these different ways to promote some homeless strategy initiative, or indeed if you're trying to allocate resources between the homeless strategy initiative and education initiative, the promise of the life satisfaction approach of well-being budgeting is that it can really provide some guidance for these kind of decisions. If you're trying to make this allocation simultaneously with thinking about allocating resources to this, or indeed to these other long-term threats with high uncertainty in their human impact, then you will just get stuck. Not just technically speaking, but probably also in a rhetorical and political sense, that the objective is no longer clear, and it's much harder to gain consensus, right? So the domains where there's relatively high uncertainty are probably also domains where partisan beliefs will tend to have a larger role in decision making. So as an example. Another example, if we think, you know, we don't allow people to make choices about many aspects of their lives, such as, do I want to invest in a smoke detector or a second exit or fire insurance? We could leave that up to the individual to do cost-benefit analysis, but we've actually instead compartmentalized those decisions and say, we're not giving you choice. You're going to have to spend money on these things, and then you can optimize your well-being in the other domains of life. So we don't mind that anymore. We kind of think, oh, there's a different principle for making this particular allocation decision in my life. So just to put that distinction another way, if I'm making a well-being indicator system and it looks like this, it's got a whole bunch of positive sounding things, security of housing and so on, and then it's got CO2 emissions per capita there. I claim that last one doesn't fit and changes not just the tone of this dashboard, but indeed its utility. And I would argue that a much better arrangement would be to have things that relate in computable ways to well-being and positive ways. You know, this may correlate positively or negatively with human well-being at any measure, individual to country, that you come up with. It's not really clear. But it's going to make much more sense to instead have a different policy making system, which, for instance, just restricts all policy so that it has to be consistent with decarbonizing. And then we can focus our well-being approach in government to optimizing well-being within the constraints. And so this is really the gist, and I'm guessing maybe the newest or most controversial part of what I'm proposing, which is that a bunch of our hardest decisions need to be separated out and imposed as constraints on policy rather than being part of a well-being budgeting framework. In order for that well-being budgeting framework to be politically feasible, to be valuable, and not overwhelmed. So just to summarize that, then I've mentioned some benefits of a well-being framework, but I think they're at risk of being lost if they're diluted by the things that that framework really can't handle. And so, of course, I'm quite concerned about this because there are no well-being budgeting frameworks yet. And so for, as agencies start to consider this kind of thing, I think there's a risk that these efforts will suffer bad outcomes if we let people throw all kinds of different measures and outcomes that are not really conceptually well related to human well-being into the well-being part, into the part that is rhetorically sold as about human well-being. And so for me, that human well-being part really needs to focus on the near and medium term, on a generation kind of time scale, things that we can get our heads around and make cost-benefit trade-offs. And the other stuff is going to have to be dealt with in another way. So there are these practical accounting issues, but also really this rhetorical and framing issue that I've mentioned. And I've gone over time, so let me keep moving quickly here. So just to recap then, this overall framework has a set of constraints, possibly many, that are essentially, you could call them ecological or conservation constraints, although not all sustainability challenges or risks that meet my definition are really environmentally related. I mentioned some of these other black swan things which you wouldn't call environmental. So there are other aspects of society, of our institutions, which we say, well, this shouldn't change quickly. We're going to keep this institution the way it is, not because that's necessarily optimal, but because we don't know well enough, and so we don't want it to change quickly. So this is really the system here that I'm proposing, in which we create new institutions that do something that looks like our cap and trade or decarbonization efforts in the case of climate change, that pose hard constraints to capture long-term sustainability risks. And then within that, we make the best use we can of the knowledge that we've got from the science of well-being. And so that's all I wanted to say. I mean, I'll maybe summarize one last time here. So life satisfaction has these several roles that are useful in a measuring concept, in framing public discourse and political discourse about progress, about well-being, about the object of our governance systems. And so policy then can, in principle, start to be guided by increasingly what we know about promoting human well-being. And I think this is somewhat revolutionary because of everything we've learned about the really the social aspects of what makes for a good life. However, if we do that, we don't get anywhere close to doing what we need to achieve sustainability. And moreover, if we try and blend those together, we'll do a bad job, and probably no one will even buy into the well-being framework. And so these difficult long-term things need to be handled differently, and I propose what's more or less a conservation approach. Okay, and I really look forward to discussion. Let me unshare and open up for questions.
Yes, hello, Chris. I wanted to just first ask if you are looking for questions in, say, the chat, or if we should, in some cases, there's opportunity to raise our hand, or are you looking for questions in particular way?
Thank you for the moderation help. Yeah, so I'm looking at the chat. We're a small crowd right now, so I'm happy to just have people jump in. I can also, if that's difficult for anyone, I'm going to watch for raised hands as well, if you can see a raised hand icon.
Okay,
You want to
great.
start us
I
off?
guess I'll go ahead and start then. Yeah. First off, fantastic. I really appreciate what you had to say. You addressed a lot of the questions I had initially. And then just to push a little, Frey and others have argued against maximizing happiness, but from kind of a moral hazard point of view. And if I understand correctly, you're maximizing happiness, but not in the, say, focus strictly on maximizing happiness. You're using it really in this budgeting way. So you're really circumventing the concern, or do you feel that you're circumventing the concerns raised by Frey in this regard? Or Frey?
So, can you spell out the moral hazard argument just so that we're all on the same page about it?
So basically, if you use subjective well-being to kind of evaluate, let's say, social progress, and then people can choose to respond in a certain way. So say it's a regional thing, and you're going to allocate more or less resources to a particular canton if you're in Switzerland. And so then you say that you're actually less satisfied with your life than you really are, so that you can manipulate the system, get more resources allocated towards your canton.
So I think there are a few angles to respond to in that. I mean, one thing that especially the smaller government jurisdictions have to think about. Well, I mean, actually, I guess given the way the data are now, the life satisfaction data by themselves are insufficient to get very high time resolution, very high spatial resolution of life satisfaction itself. Okay, let me step back and say there are two things that you get by measuring life satisfaction of a population. One of them is to be able to track life satisfaction trends and distributions themselves. And the other is the insight into the coefficients, is the ability to learn about the average effects of conditions and possible policy outcomes. So it's one thing that discussions we've had with local governments is if they need higher spatial resolution, they're going to run their own survey. But there's no way, which is costly, very costly, but there's no way they're going to get enough data from their own survey to really start generating these coefficients. So in most cases, understanding the coefficients is knowledge about the coefficients. So that's the database of happiness coefficients. That's really the insight for budgeting, is going to necessarily be informed by broader evidence, including global, right? So, I mean, we only really have confidence that we're getting at something fundamental about humans when we see consistency all around the world. On the other hand, naturally, local effects and local environments matter as well. So there's going to be a combination of evidence. Now, on the small scale, that could buy, the people changing their answering strategically could bias both. But I'm saying that it's not the sole source of evidence in the well-being budgeting process, which is maybe what you're referring to about how this framework, gets around the moral hazard problem. And the other thing is that, well, I mean, so this, I can't actually remember how I've come to this belief now, so that's embarrassing, but I'm not so worried about the moral hazard problem, just because I think actually from everything we know about this question, people take the question quite seriously. And, there's only so much you can, anyway, so I think the concern is valid. Maybe the only other thing I'd say before I let somebody else talk is, there are many, I mean, life satisfaction is on the surface is a crazy thing to measure. It's the most objective question you could ask. And it's just that from everything we've learned, it seems to be a vastly better way in many cases, it looks sort of like the ideal thing, but it's a vastly better way to make decisions than what we are doing now. It has huge implications to do things differently from what we have now, and those all seem correct. And so we shouldn't let there's so much to be gained by shifting directions towards the insights from life satisfaction, even if there are problems. I mean, some of my own research is to do with measurement problems in life satisfaction, but in the end, they end up being small compared to the implications they have for changing direction of policy. Joseph, do you want me to speak out loud, or shall I read your question? Okay, so I'm just going to, oh, there it is.
Just go ahead and respond. I think everybody can see the question.
Okay, sure. For the purpose of the recording, how do you feel about the recent push concerning the use of eudaimonic measures of well-being rather than hedonic measures? How would the use of eudaimonic measures affect your well-being budgeting ideas? My best answer here is to honestly plead non-expertise, right? So my take on I've never understood the So I mean, my take on the life satisfaction measure is really that we don't want to know people's subjective views on almost anything. There's only one thing I want to know people's subjective views on, and that's how it feels altogether. The rest, wherever possible, I'd like to appeal to objective measurables about people's lives and relate them to how it feels. So if you're also asking me how meaningful my life is, or something like this, questions to do with meaning, I think just like anything, I mean, first of all, that's subjective. So while it's important, it would be nice if I could instead predict that component of life satisfaction through objective measurables. But regardless, it seems like if that is important, it's important to what? It's important to my overall view of life. So at some level, I'm not sure that one can argue this without just making philosophical, without value statements. But for me, the eudaimonic stuff is, our eudaimonic experiences are important because of how they play into the overall experience of life, and that's what life satisfaction is supposed to be getting at. Yes.
Thank you.
Mark.
Yeah, thanks for an interesting talk. I see a lot of people kind of advocating for this life satisfaction budgeting stuff nowadays. I suppose I'm fairly skeptical, but I want to put some tough questions up, but in a kind of generous spirit. Like I don't mean to be too critical, but so the way I'd phrase this question is, why do you think that life satisfaction as a sole metric, or not a sole metric, but as a principal metric, why should it be our primary metric, given that what you said earlier was that we should measure what matters, presumably what matters to citizens, right? Because in a democracy, it's the citizens who determine what is normatively legitimate. If we're interested in what matters to citizens, my impression is that when these well-being public policy initiatives occur and we do surveys of citizens or consultations, typically subjectively assess life satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 10, because I think the measure is quite important, not just the concept, is not the things that people tend to talk about. They tend to talk about things like sustainability, access to housing, income, health, being connected to their community, this sort of stuff. And organically, these consultations produce a dashboard of indicators. And then I appreciate your point that you can't use a dashboard of indicators for cost-benefit analysis. So I think that's really important. But then my question is, was cost-benefit analysis the path of least resistance for getting more well-being perspectives into public policy? Should we not perhaps start with something less ambitious?
Such as?
So my sense is that cost-benefit analysis actually doesn't inform that much public policy, at least in Australia. It's an input to the political discourse. Public policy is mostly informed by democratic mechanisms and kind of immediate demands. So for example, In Canberra recently, which has moved to a wellbeing budgeting framework, there was, but not using life satisfaction scales, just using a very large dashboard of about 36 indicators. There was a discussion about whether we should build a light rail or whether we should expand the bus network. And that sort of discussion you could decide through life satisfaction budgeting, but you could also just decide it through democratic decisions around whether people want kind of more dense urban environments, whether they want to take trains to work or whether they want to drive, how much we want suburbs to have access to public transport versus just the kind of spine that the tram sorts out, these kind of questions. And so you could make decisions more on the basis, as you say, of moving away from income and other material concerns to thinking about well-being broadly defined, but broadly defined in terms of these indicators that I mentioned, like access to housing, access to social spaces, green spaces, etc. And the government could just adopt a different attitude rather than a different techniques.
Okay, I don't know if this is going to be sound slightly oblique as an answer, but I think the crux of my view here is, I mean, I'm trained in economics, is how I contrast life satisfaction approach with a revealed preference approach. And fundamentally, I have to, in embracing life satisfaction, I have to believe quite strongly that people could be quite wrong about answers to a lot of these questions, right? So why is it that, where, I mean, just to, well, start from a simple lab psychology experiment. You may know some of this brand of work. For instance, if I go into a lab and somebody puts an apple and a chocolate bar on the table and tells me, I am going to ask you how happy you are in 15 minutes after you choose which want to eat one of these. And I want you to predict how happy you'll be in each case if you eat one or the other, and then you can choose one and go ahead. Now, it turns out that my own prediction, you've told me what the question you're going to ask. My own prediction about what I'm going to answer to that question is less good than if the experimenter says, by the way, here's the average of what other people responded to the question after they respectively ate the apple or the chocolate bar. Okay, so I'm better off looking at the stats than I am my own introspection. So that's kind of interesting and strange, regardless of how interested you are in life satisfaction, because I have full knowledge of myself, of what the question is going to be. And yes, it's a subjective question, but I can't even predict my own. That's the affective forecasting problem, right? So, I mean, if I'm, choosing a life partner or which house to buy or something, what do? I don't introspect because I've never made those decisions before. I go and ask an elder. Or better yet, an elder who's made, I mean, we only do those things once or twice or a few times in life. What's better than asking an elder is actually to look at the literature, which compiles even broader statistics with many or millions of people. And that's actually the best information about the best prediction of how I am going to feel about my own life in the future. So, I kind of always think for progress indicators, there are two ways to make it accountable. And one is democratically and the other is empirically. And so definitely this approach I'm advocating is all on the empirical side, as opposed to, something more towards direct democracy. But I think those both have value. It's just that I'm concerned that we might be way off in how society is structured and how we're spending our time. I don't know, but a life satisfaction approach has the potential to lead us somewhere very different. I'm not sure a democratic one has the approach to lead us either as far or maybe as kind of continuously there. I mean, I'd love to hear your
well, I'm giving a talk in a few days as part of the ISQOLS webinar, so I'm sure I'll talk
more than one,
there.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Ashley. at the risk, okay, I'm going to read out, you can add to your question, I'll read out what you wrote. I wonder whether another answer to moral hazard is that in your framework, you need the objective measures combined with the subjective, since life satisfaction is not forward-looking. I mean, I think it's a good insight. The other interesting thing about life satisfaction, and one reason, I suppose I didn't mention that it may be in conflict with what we think of as sustainability, is that we don't have a perfectly good understanding of this yet, but it does seem that our life satisfaction responses may be biased towards the short term in a way that differs from how we would like to make policy. So if we, and by the way, one thing I didn't emphasize today is that there's, in my view, no risk at all of technocracy coming out from this well-being budgeting approach. And the reasons for that are, number one, there's intrinsic uncertainty and room for debate in the investment models, in our beliefs about how particular investments, social investments, will pay off over time. And the other is, none of this gets around the distributional issues. So average life satisfaction is just an average, and that's as bad a thing to measure as average income. You always are interested in the full distribution, and no one is going to tell you a mechanistic way, a uniquely correct way to make decisions about distributions. So, so there will always be room for, let's say, partisan debate on these things. At the same time, having a framework with which to, a well-being framework with which to explain your decisions and your trade-offs that you've made, I think is extremely valuable. So that's kind of my answer about the forward-looking, is that we, we may want as a society to make our decisions using a well-being framework, but still not, explicitly not in the way that you would maybe infer by the trade-offs that I might make as an individual, even with an eye to well-being, because I discount the well-being of the older Chris for some reason quite strongly. Well, that's according to kind of revealed preferences, I suppose, but that's maybe more related to that claim is maybe more based on revealed preference evidence than it is on life satisfaction evidence. But I'm projecting. So before Kelsey, I wanted to grab Micah.
Yeah, hi, speaking. Thanks so much for the talk. I just had a quick question, or maybe big question, but on how we should decide on what the constraints should be. So you talk sort of about sustainability constraints, and my understanding was the motivation for doing that are that these things are quite important and can't easily be handled by life satisfaction or well-being data. And so we should use them as constraints in a well-being budget. Although I sort of imagine arguments could be made for other things like freedom, principles of democracy or freedom that are also important but can't maybe easily be handled under a well-being framework. So I'm wondering if you sort of have a theory or idea about how we should decide on these constraints and not without sort of opening the door to everything else that just doesn't fit neatly under a well-being framework.
Short answer, no. It's a dichotomy that in my paper I say it's a false dichotomy. Actually, that's not a complete. That's not even the only thing you're asking about, maybe. But things would go from the can't deal with it to the can deal with it, possibly as models and knowledge evolve. And you could argue about whether if I say the criterion is the confidence interval of our predictions, then that's a continuous variable. It can be, there's no obvious threshold for a dichotomous classification. And moreover, I don't know how to get those policies through, right? I mean, I think it seems to be feasible, and I think we need to make more of a habit of it. So my thinking is maybe cruder there, and I suppose my paradigm, the easy to go to paradigm is climate change right now, in that my characterization of what we've done with climate change policy is that economists are kind of responsible for wasting 2.5 decades with the idea that there are some parameters in our models that we're not sure what value to have, and so we can't predict with enough confidence what the social costs are, and so we're going to carry on working on this, and that's a great excuse to just wait. And I think if society had more of an idea that, hey, there's stuff that we just don't know about, and the best practice is to make sure those stocks, those variables, those institutions, including I think what you're referring to as institutions, those things don't change quickly. It's okay for them to change, but let's just put rules on ourselves so they don't change quickly. Then we could have seen that we need to slow down the climate change until we understand it better. And so, so my working definition of sustainability is meant to capture certain institutions. We have constitutions, not because we can't all imagine how to make them better, but because we have slowly changing constitutions, not because we can't all imagine how to make them better, but because the risks, because the possible unintended consequences of changing them are quite unknown, and so we want to make it difficult to change them, not impossible, but difficult. So levels of freedom, which you might say are changing very rapidly right now in terms of privacy and so on, but so we could argue about how fundamental some of those things are. But that's the kind of an institution that we might put some kind of safeguards on and say, well, that's in the sustainability category.
Great, thanks.
Mark and then Kelsey.
I think Kelsey actually got in before me, so
thank you, Kelsey.
Mark, if you want to go, it's fine. I'm going to send an email to Chris anyway, so if you want to go, it's fine.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. So just a follow-up question to my earlier one, is especially because you then raised the issue of technocracy. I just wonder if, like, part of the advocacy for life satisfaction scales as a major input into policy seems to be this notion of taking citizens seriously about how they judge their own lives and putting them at the top of the decision tree. I think Clark, Freiders, Layard, the LSE group has said things like that in some of their recent work. But do you think there's a tension between that and kind of what you said earlier about people have biases in the way that they report, and they're bad at affective forecasting, and so we should look at the statistics, which of course is then the purview of the experts. Does that not give rise to technocracy?
I'm not sure I see the proposition clearly. So the affective forecasting is not so much a problem. I don't have to worry about me knowing how good life is going to be in 30 years as far as the policy goes, because I can look to the stats and add 30 years to my age and look at what the determinants of people that age are, and that's a really good insight into what will determine my well-being at that age. I feel, individuals are not expert on, they're just not the right expert on most of these predictive questions. If you ask me, how would life be better or worse under some scenario in 5 years, for my own life, I'm actually the best source of information for that. I'm not a useless one, but what I am the world's expert on is how life feels right now. All things taken into account, that's what I'm the world's expert on. So I'm not sure if this fits your language. That's a very bottom-up kind of, I don't know if I'm on the top of the decision hierarchy that way. It's a bottom-up contribution to knowledge about making lives better. So I don't know how that part relates to technocracy. So technocracy, but the technocracy fear I was trying to address is just the idea that society or political process loses its free will somehow. And so I'm not worried about that. We're nowhere, it just seems like this is something that can inform, it can be a framework for discourse, it can correctly inform us, it can do a lot better in guiding us in certain directions. But it leaves enormous scope.
Okay.
I'm afraid so. We're well past 1 hour. I can stay indefinitely. So I'd just like to thank everyone for coming, and I'm going to continue the conversation as long as anybody wants to stick around.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead, Kelsey.
Great, thanks for sticking around. So I'm interested in how you propose to deal with adaptation. So most of our evidence, right, is comparing different people or relatively short-run changes. And there's really only a few papers looking at adaptation to various events. And so especially when we look at, the very long run, what do you think we can do to address those issues?
Be honest in our database of happiness coefficients, be honest and critical. And I mean, imagine that we actually as a community were all looking at the database of happiness coefficients. So I've had a student kind of trying to bring the Canadian the evidence from Canadian data, and then also possibly fill in some, well, no, mostly not fill in holes, but actually note gaps, right? So if there's an obvious row missing in our database, how wonderful. If we had these databases could presumably be somewhat regionally or country specific, but also integrated. And if there are empty rows, if there are low rated review based coefficients, says, look, we still don't have good panel studies on this. What a great way to guide funding agencies and research. I mean, I guess that's the end of the really short answer. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. The problem is that, if it's going to a policymaker, then they may skip the notes. And so I was actually having a similar discussion just earlier today, that in some cases, we really shouldn't be giving quantitative results, right? So it should be maybe order of magnitudes. So instead of an effect size of 0.66, we say, all right, like say in the example of unemployment, unemployment has a large effect, and then we say something else has a medium effect or small. And because the vast majority, we have even fewer studies that are causal. The vast majority of them are cross-sectional, right? And so it's really difficult to do anything with that. And so I worry about giving it to a policymaker because I don't trust them to look at the notes.
So, I mean, I guess the IPCC has been through a lot of the same kind of consideration, right? I mean, an order of magnitude is still quantitative, but there's definitely communication issues there. I think it would be great to start thinking about that. I'm not, the difference between an order of magnitude and a confidence interval and a point estimate where someone has forgotten to give a standard error or something is a matter of, it's a matter of communication. That's not really, I mean, there's a continuum in the communication there. So I think building a database of happiness coefficients is a great way to sober oneself about how many causal studies we have. I mean, it's no surprise. It's impossibly difficult to find exclusion restrictions on something which explicitly includes everything. But yeah, I mean, I imagine that pursuing this direction starts to give beneficial direction immediately, right? I mean, we can say something I think we have some confidence about the relative impact of unemployment versus other stuff. And I think not only will it push governments to do more rationalizing and more projection, but also research community to seek out the stuff that's really needed. As always in research, when you have an audience, a decision maker audience ready before you do the research, it's very motivating and focusing.
Thank you. I guess I can leave it here. I will send you an email just because I found this very helpful.
Well, I really look forward to ongoing conversations with some of you, and thanks again for everyone for coming and joining the discussion. Barring any other questions, we'll leave it there. Thanks.